recorded in the beautiful mountains of British Columbia. Welcome to
Friends on Horses.
Welcome back to Friends on Horses. Today we get to talk to Annika McGivern. Annika is a sports and exercise psychology consultant, as well as an Equine Canada competition coach. She helps equestrians deal with the pressure of competition and develop that winning mindset. Annika has her Master's of Science in Exercise Psychology and a Bachelor's of Psychology. She has conducted research on current mental health challenges in the equestrian sport. Today we get to talk to Annika about how to take steps towards gaining more control over thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Welcome to the podcast, Annika.
Hello, thanks so much for having me.
This is such an exciting episode. You bring such a unique skill set to your work, just with your background in science and psychology, and also your background with working with equines and that passion. So I'm wondering if we can just kind of start at the beginning and just how did both of those things become a passion for you, and when did they blend into one?
Yeah, for sure. So the passion for horses definitely came first. That was something that, I don't know, just was something I suppose I think I always had. My mother loved horses, although she didn't have horses when we were growing up, but I had this feeling she sort of passed on that initial love to me. And when I was about 6, we were actually living on Gabriola Island at the time, and my mom went to set up some riding lessons for some Korean students that she was teaching English to. And the story goes that I came along with her, and then after that sort of wouldn't stop requesting my own lessons. And then the rest is history. So I rode sort of most of my life, most of my childhood, I should say. And then when I moved to Nelson at the age of 11 and started riding with a local coach, Brandy Saunders, that's when I really fell in love with the specific sport of 3-day eventing. So that really became my passion then through high school. And that passion, sort of when I graduated high school, I didn't have a very clear picture of what I wanted to go back to university to study. All I knew is that I wanted to keep riding. I wanted to really, really pursue, sort of see how far I could go in the sport. And I also really wanted to travel. And so I ended up sort of combining those two things by initially moving to Ireland and working for a professional show jumper. And then, which was a great adventure. And then when that wrapped up, I came back to Nelson briefly and then moved to Australia to work for 2 different professional 3D adventures, and had another big adventure there. And so I think it was there in that kind of world of professional sport, which is really the first time that I tasted that. Realistically, things are pretty small scale in British Columbia when we look at the equestrian sport. And so it was that first taste of the professional world where the psychology of competing really started to intrigue me. And it was sort of a slow building interest. And particularly as I then started really pushing myself further up the levels and really challenging the edges of my abilities, I think it just really started to hit home for me that there was a lot more going on there's a lot more required to be successful than just kind of what you were always told, like just sort of the physical training and the technical and physical skills. So there was one particular incident. I'd come back from Australia. I was actually down in Seattle working for another 3-day adventure there, and I'd had recently bought a new horse, and I was trying to move up the levels, and I was much too enthusiastic. It was a level I've been wanting to get to for a long time, and I sort of finally had the horse that I felt was gonna get me there. And so I was a little bit too eager and fell off in the cross country phase at my first 2 competitions. And not bad falls, wasn't injured really at all. But an interesting thing happened. I got back after that second fall. I started going back to my regular training, and I all of a sudden could not see a distance to a jump. Like not even a cross rail. And I started like getting really reactive about that and stressing out about it. And as you can imagine, started interfering with my hands and probably doing not nice things to my horse's mouth. And so he started stopping. He was like, clearly you don't know what's going on here. So I'm not going to take you over this jump. So that experience was seriously rattling for me, because my horse loved to jump. Actually, it was probably his biggest joy. And I felt I'd broken him, and I felt that I'd forgotten everything I learned about riding. And none of my coaches could seem to sort it out for me, and I couldn't seem to sort it out. And so at that point, I remembered a brief interaction that I'd had with a sports psychologist back at some training camps years previously. And it occurred to me that, oh, maybe this is the time when you need a sports psychologist. And so I contacted him, and he was amazing. He basically sorted me out in 3 Skype sessions, and the problem was fixed. And so I was so impressed by that, by the efficacy of it, and how much I learned about myself and my ability as an athlete, that I just immediately felt like it was something I needed to know more about. And that curiosity developed into me choosing to pursue that as a career.
I'm curious, for coming from the perspective of someone who has gone through the process of having a sport psychologist themselves, what were the big pieces for you that you took out of that kind of changed your dynamic as a rider again?
Mm-hmm. I think the first one was just the realization that the way I was thinking about myself was directly impacting my my ability to ride in a really like tangible way. I don't know that I'd ever really believed that was possible before. And so the biggest thing was that it just it felt like it opened my eyes to this whole other side of being competitive, of being your best, being a good rider, that I sort of felt like I didn't know about before. So it's this idea that the way that we think, so yeah, the first thing would be the way that we think has a huge impact on our ability as a rider. And that secondly, that we actually have the power to fix that or change that or influence that with relatively simple processes.
I'm curious, just as having a background in psychology yourself, what are the processes that are most often drawn on in sports psychology medicine to look at some of those different pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. So a really common one is, so obviously with competition, athletes face a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, and that's like universal across all sports. And so I would say that one of the biggest things that we work on with athletes is the ability to manage that, so that you're still able to perform, so that the anxiety or the stress or the pressure doesn't take over your ability to perform at your best. And I think, everyone who's competed knows that feeling of absolutely nailing something at home, and then for some reason getting to the show and it all falls apart and you suddenly feel like, there's no way you could possibly do it. And so that experience is the experience of the impact of sort of nerves and anxiety and just that biological response that happens in us. So that would be the first one. I think the second one would be around beliefs and belief systems. One of my favorite things about psychology and using it in sport is that it allows people to really dig into their own belief systems, and first of all sort of discover what they are, because we often don't, we're not deeply aware of our beliefs, and sometimes we're aware of certain sections of our beliefs but not at all about others. So it can be very interesting to dig in and discover what your own beliefs or someone else's beliefs are about something, and then go through the process of replacing what we would call a limiting belief, which is a belief that ultimately holds you back from achieving your true potential, with a belief that is more accurate and more helpful. And that process, again, it's sort of beautifully simple and yet deeply challenging all at the same time, but it can have really amazing sort of life-changing results for people.
Wow.
So probably those two would be the main things.
And what, okay, so give us an example of what a limiting belief might be.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as a little bit of a precursor, so beliefs are things that usually form when we're quite young. They usually start as an idea that we have about ourselves, and then they're reinforced through our experiences over time until it becomes something that you consider to be absolutely true about yourself. So that's really important to realize that often it doesn't necessarily feel like something you believe. It's something that you actually just see as fact or as truth about yourself. So an example of a limiting belief could be that I'm not creative. So imagine someone maybe getting feedback in school when they're younger that they're not very good at drawing, or they don't seem to ever get praise from the teacher, maybe like this other kid does about their artwork. Or maybe they just have gotten some sort of feedback when they're younger that they're not great at coming up with solutions to problems potentially. And then that kind of forms this idea, oh, maybe I'm not good at art, maybe I'm not good at problem solving. And then once we form these ideas, there's a process in the brain where we actually sort of seek out information that confirms our ideas. And so that process sort of happens, or that experience is confirmed over time, and then that can kind of deepen down into this deeply held belief that I'm not creative. So the issue with that is that that may then prevent me from pursuing a line of work that has a creative component to it. It may prevent me from going after a promotion because I feel like that next level at my job actually has a huge creative element to it. So I suppose that's not really a sport specific example, but it's one that comes up a lot for people. If you were to take it more back into the sport realm, it could be sort of an idea that I'm not actually. This is something that you would see a lot in equestrian sport, is that we don't tend to think of ourselves as athletes. We tend to think of the horse as the athlete, and so with that. That can be kind of built on some limiting beliefs around your belief in your own ability to be really athletic and strong, et cetera, which can then limit the way that we behave as athletes and ultimately then impact our outcomes.
That's amazing. I'm thinking about all these narratives that I have about myself right now. all these stories that we write about ourselves because based on our learning history throughout our lives that aren't necessarily who we really are, or prevent us from being kind of developing into the person that we would like to be. That's pretty cool.
It's cool once you start thinking about it. It's a great line of thought to follow. So based off of that's a really great word, sort of narrative and story, and I use that a lot when I am explaining this stuff to people, because there's a sequence that happens where what we're usually aware of is what we would call our self-talk or your automatic thoughts. Those are little words that pop into your head kind of unannounced and unrequested, things like I'm not good enough, I can't do this, this is scary. And so those types of thoughts are usually fueled by limiting beliefs. So one of the best ways to discover some limiting beliefs that you may have is to start to pay attention to those negative thoughts that pop into your head. And usually there's a few in certain experiences that kind of come up on repeat for certain people. And so if you can, or rather everyone has certain thoughts that come up in specific situations, is a better way of explaining it. So if you can pay attention to those reoccurring thoughts, you can kind of trace them back then to the limiting belief.
And then, Mira, you go for it.
No, that's okay. I was just thinking, so once you're aware of that piece, is there a process that you start working with athletes to kind of walk them through, like re-narrating that piece of their story? Or are you just kind of, I guess, are you going back to sort of the beginnings of that story, or are you changing kind of the way ahead? So once you have that awareness, is it about kind of looking ahead and changing that story? or are you kind of going back and changing where it originally came from? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, definitely. No, that's a really good question. The answer is a little bit of both. So what I would do is start with looking back, and it can be really enlightening for some people to just think through kind of where that limiting belief comes from, just as a way of sort of fully understanding it and getting their head around it. And the first step towards sort of just disrupting that belief is to start to build some evidence against it. So this idea of limiting beliefs comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an area in psychology that basically works around the idea that problematic thoughts in humans are based on irrational thoughts and irrational beliefs that aren't actually true. And so that is kind of the core of a limiting belief, is that we believe it to be true, but they're not actually true. It's something that we've made true for ourselves. And so the first step is to just start to disrupt that sense of rigidness that people hold around their limiting beliefs by trying to come up with some suggestions or some evidence that disprove them. So going back to the creativity example, you would sort of have a conversation with that person and start to pull out examples of where they are actually creative in their lives or have been creative in their lives in the past, as just sort of evidence to start to disrupt that. And once people start to sort of hear that evidence and think it through, you can very quickly start to kind of shake the foundations of that belief and kind of open up the idea to changing it. And it depends how ready someone is for that process. Usually when people are engaging and work with sports psychologists, they're quite ready, they're quite keen to change, they're quite interested in the process of improving or changing. But having said that, sometimes the area of limiting beliefs can be a sensitive place for people. It can be kind of a tricky place to go, and it can be difficult to let go of beliefs that we have about ourselves. And so it's not always straightforward.
I can imagine, because I'm thinking about some of my own previous limiting beliefs that I have dumped. It can feel almost like a safety net. Some of these limiting beliefs can feel like there's something that tethers you to something that maybe protects you in some fashion or connects you with your family. It's like, my family is this, right? So therefore I am, and then saying, okay, I'm not going to be, I'm not this, can be scary for some people, because that might mean, that'll create some distance between them and their families, or that might change the way they look at their relationship with their horses, or any of those pieces. I can imagine that there's probably a bit of a safety and a security component and a lot connected to some of these very simple sounding limiting beliefs, hey?
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, we often talk about that, is that most limiting beliefs were useful to that person at some point in their lives. They served a purpose at some point. Very often it is sort of a purpose of protection, of coping with various challenges that they've maybe gone through in their life. And so part of the process is to sort of acknowledge that even though that was something that served you at one time, that it's not helping you anymore. And so it's useful now to let go of that. But absolutely, and there is a sense of there's a lot of emotion around it often. It often can be challenging also to let go of something that you believed strongly for a long time and maybe built a lot of actions and decisions around. Maybe that belief has actually shaped your life in some way. And then somehow, I think, by acknowledging that it's not true or it's been limiting you, can be almost a bit frightening, because you're then sort of admitting that, those choices that you made, that you felt really sure about at that time, maybe now you're looking back and questioning. So it can be a disrupting process, definitely. And it's certainly, it's worth it. As I always say to people, it's absolutely worth it to get to the other side of it. But it can definitely be a bit of an emotional, bumpy ride sometimes.
I'm wondering, I think often when people think kind of, sports psychology and kind of delving into this kind of really deeper work, when we're looking at our relationship to our sport and progressing in our sport, they think of, high performance athletes, the ones that we're seeing on TV, the ones that are competing at international levels. What is sort of the scope of athletes that you're working with in your practice? Is it just those higher end, or do you find that these are pieces that can be helpful to, even kind of the backyard athlete, if you would?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think that that is really the future of the industry right now, is to start to bring this knowledge down through to the grassroots. What we see a lot now is that athletes get up to the professional level and then they sort of suddenly encounter sports psychology for the first time, which is very similar to my experience. I didn't get to a professional level with grading, but it was only when I sort of got up to a fairly serious level that it suddenly became something that I needed. And it was because of something that went wrong. And so in a way, it was a Band-Aid. It was something that I found as a solution to a problem, which is fine. And that is a lot of the way that a lot of people come across it. But what I would really love, and what I hope, to do with my career, is to start teaching this stuff like from the ground up, so that riders are growing up, athletes are growing up, incorporating this stuff into their development from day one, so that by the time they get to those upper levels, that they're not having to go out and find Band-Aids, that they've done the work ahead of time to be really prepared for those situations. And so I'm really hopeful that that is the direction that sports psychology is going, and that's sort of the type of work that I get really excited about. Of course, it's always really thrilling and exciting to work with professional athletes, who are at the top of their game and doing amazing things. But I also really, really enjoy the process of making this more accessible to people at all levels.
What are some of the more common barriers that you find in getting through to the general horse community? Why might people not be reaching out to you when they feel they might need you?
I think the biggest one in the horse community, and I find this really sort of fun to think about, coming from my own equestrian athlete background, is that equestrian sport is quite unique in that, first of all, it's a partnership. So there's two athletes involved, the human and the horse. Mm-hmm. And within that partnership, unlike any other sport, all of the attention and the focus and the energy and the money goes into the equine or the horse side of that partnership. And I mean, I lived that. And it's very much a part of the culture of our world and our sport. And I think it's a beautiful thing, because, it's wonderful how much people care about their equine athletes and their partners, and how much effort goes into it. However, coming now from the outside perspective, as well as a psychology consultant, it was an interesting process for me to start to see some potential problems with that culture. And I think one of the problems is that in putting 100% of our focus onto the equine athlete, we actually miss out on opportunities to focus, necessary opportunities to focus in on ourselves, because we are, after all, 50% of the partnership. And we are the 50% of the partnership that has complete influence and control over the well-being of the other 50% of the horse. In fact, we have complete control over the well-being of the whole partnership, ourselves and the horse. And so I think one of the barriers is that, because we, equestrian athletes put all their time and money and attention into the extra services, chiropractic, massage, etc., for their horses, and giving them the best of the best, there isn't always money or time left over for a personal service like sports psychology, which is all about focusing on the human athlete. And there isn't always the space in the culture for an athlete to prioritize that. I think that it's sort of seen as the thing to do, to prioritize the horse over the human. And so one thing that I'm hoping to move towards in equestrian sport is just a balancing of that. So that, because I actually believe that the best thing for the horses is for us as the humans, the riders, to be taking the best care of ourselves as possible. And I see the mental side as a huge component of that, that ultimately does have a big impact, probably a bigger impact on our horses than whether or not they're getting twice weekly chiropractic, for example, because they're so sensitive to our moods and the way that we are around them. So yes, I think the main barrier is just sort of that culture and just sort of the sheer lack of time and money that, you know, most equestrians can relate to. Having said that, I do believe that it's becoming much more accepted and much more normalized to work with the sports psychologist within equestrian sport. And so there's not a lot of direct barriers anymore. I think people are becoming increasingly intrigued, which is great. I'm excited to have the opportunity to, you know, to work with more and more equestrian athletes.
What are some of them? Because I read that you had done some research on mental health specific to the equestrian sport. So I would love if you can elaborate a little bit about some of the mental health challenges specific to us equestrians.
Yeah, absolutely. So that research was conducted across 5 different countries. So Canada, America, Australia, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. So it was really fun to be able to look at such a broad scope of equestrian athletes, and then also to sort of make some tentative comparisons between countries. So the main things that we looked at were, so basically when we try to collect measurements of things like, you know, depression or mental health issues in psychology, it's usually through a self-report a scale. So where the person would sort of fill out answers to questions and tick, you know, okay, how do you feel about this on a scale of sort of 1 to 7? So that's how we would collect the information. There's definitely some flaws with that, but it is sort of the best way that we have to do it at this point in time. So based off of that research, we looked at depression and well-being and resilience. So resilience is kind of the ability to adapt successfully in the face of adversity or challenges, which is obviously a really useful skill for everyone, but particularly for athletes. And well-being sort of was a broad spectrum analysis of sort of personal well-being, social well-being, and environmental well-being. It just refers to our sort of sense of contentment and healthiness and happiness. And then depression is obviously a more familiar topic that relates sort of directly to our sense of control and happiness. And so what the specific angle of the research was actually to see if concussion history had a direct impact on those 3 measures. So equestrian sport has one of the highest concussion rates of any sport in the world. Lucky us. And so I found that really interesting, that there's a lot of research being done in concussion and well-being in sports like hockey or rugby or football, where, you know, there's kind of an obvious collision and people are sort of aware of the concussion rates. But there was absolutely no research being done on equestrian athletes, even though our concussion rates are similar or sometimes even higher to those more obvious sports. And so what the research found was that there was a link, but you can never sort of say that one thing causes another in this type of sort of early research, but there was a link between those athletes who'd had 1 or more concussions tended to have slightly higher depression scores, slightly lower well-being, and there was no direct link with resilience. Overall, we did see that about 27% of the sample was within the cutoff for what we would call a major depressive disorder, which is just sort of a clinical level of depression. So that was quite interesting, and that was in line with a lot of other studies that have been done with athlete groups. And what we're starting to see now is that athletes actually are a little bit more prone towards mental health challenges, which is in direct contrast to the kind of previous idea that was popular, that athletes were sort of mentally stronger than the average human being. But we see now more and more that actually the reality of the kind of lifestyle of the athlete, where they are actually facing probably more pressure, more challenges maybe than the average human, does sort of put them at higher risk. So I suppose to sum all that up, I feel like I just went on a bit of a ramble there. I think the main messages for me were that equestrian sport is like most other sports, where we do face a vulnerability to mental health challenges. And so it means that there will be a huge benefit to equestrians to embracing some more mental health practices, more mental health awareness, and sort of incorporating what we know in sports psychology about safeguarding all that stuff as more of a culture of the sport. It definitely makes a strong case too for everybody wearing those helmets, which we know we all are pretty good about these days, but the odd time maybe we slip up. And that there is just so much more work to be done in that area. There's very little research on equestrian athletes, and so there does need to be a lot more done to kind of bolster those findings and add certainty to them, if you will. But I think that there's definitely going to be definite value for equestrian athletes to just start to think about how we can sort of work the culture of well-being and all that goes on along with that sort of into the culture on a more day-to-day basis.
It's interesting, you know, I'm thinking about the times that we're currently living through, and just conversations that I've had with a lot of my horsey friends, where, you know, our connection to our horses has really been, you know, a source of strength and a source of resilience, as you were saying, of just, you know, managing some of those extra kind of stresses that come with uncertainty. I'm wondering if that's something that you notice in your work as well, that, you know, hearing you talk about, you know, the psychological aspect of sport and competition and that maybe being a stress, is there also moments when, you know, horses are also maybe filling people's buckets as well, just that relationship?
Absolutely. I think, and this is just sort of a personal theory, there's no research that backs this up, but as such, although I'd say most horse people would agree with me, that there is a huge kind of psychological safety and benefit that we receive from our interaction with horses. So we would say that in psychological terms, it would be like a buffer to mental health challenges. And I was curious to see if that sort of, if anything turned up in the research that showed that maybe equestrian athletes were slightly less prone, say, to depression than other groups. And I sort of had this feeling, oh, you know, maybe there is a buffer effect with horses. So that sort of didn't show up in the data. However, I really, you know, I think there's enough anecdotal evidence out there that really supports the idea, and it's something we just all know as horsey people deep down, that that being with horses is good for us. However, I think that there's so much we can do to really kind of build on that. I think there's a sort of natural well-being that we do absolutely get from being around our horses. And we can sort of exist in that space where we just sort of enjoy that, and we feel that it improves our lives and that that's a really good thing. But I think if we bring a little bit more awareness to it and sort of make use of it a little bit more consciously and sort of actively look after our own sort of state of mind or our mindset as a part of that, that the benefits of that will actually become much, much greater over time. So, for example, when we're talking about sort of this current situation that we're in, a topic that comes up a lot is mindset. And so mindset is it's a phenomenon that is based off of your beliefs. So it's a mindset is basically a set of beliefs that directly influences your thoughts and your actions. And there's kind of two prominent mindsets that get talked about a lot. One is a growth mindset and one is a fixed mindset. And so a growth mindset is based off of the belief that you are able to improve at any sort of set of skills or abilities, as long as you're willing to apply a lot of effort and time. But as long as you put in the effort and you work at it, that you will be able to improve. And so what comes along with that is this sense that challenges are good things because they give us opportunities to really push ourselves and see where our weaknesses are and find them, and therefore by seeing them, knowing what we need to work on to improve. Likewise, failures, although still challenging, are an opportunity again to sort of find out what we need to work on and therefore improve. On the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, with a fixed mindset, that's based off the belief that you sort of are limited. You only have a certain amount of talent in one area, and that's all you get. And it doesn't really matter how hard you work at it. That's how good you're ever going to be. Mm. And so in that sort of set of beliefs, challenges are kind of scary things because they might actually expose you as someone who's not as good as you want to be. Okay. It might create a situation where that allows people to see that you're actually not very good at this thing that you want to be good at. Failures are really challenging because they're like confirming of the sense that we're just not good at the thing that we want to be good at, and therefore should be avoided. And so what happens is when you kind of look at these two mindsets, obviously the growth mindset leads to continued growth and improvement. And the fixed mindset, although you can still succeed and do well with the fixed mindset, that person usually won't ever reach their full potential because they're always going to be kind of blocking themselves. And so when we look at a situation that we're in right now, which is like a huge set of challenges, sort of one challenge after the other, the belief that we have the ability to grow and adapt and learn and improve as a result of these challenges is so key to our sort of psychological health in how we interpret the situation, how we see ourselves getting through it, and ultimately how we actually will get through it. And so by applying that mindset to the situation, it completely flips it from something that's potentially devastating and life-altering and sort of unrecoverable to a huge opportunity that's going to give you a chance to learn something new, to develop in a way that you hadn't seen the opportunity to develop before, learn new skills, and that it's going to shape your life ultimately in a positive way. Mm-hmm. So to circle back to your question there, if we can really actively become aware of concepts like mindset and apply those in our lives, I believe that we can become much sort of steadier in our approach to life, and that sort of steadiness really impacts our relationship with our horses because they really crave consistency. And I think, consistency and clarity and sort of fairness is so much at the heart of really good horsemanship and really good training. And so the more that we can manage our mind and create that consistency within ourselves, the more that's going to be able to apply it through to our training and our riding and really create that strong bond that we all want with our horses.
And what about can we pull kind of this growth mindset into helping us push through motivation slumps, or is there another route that you take to help riders get through maybe when they're suffering from a little bit of lack of motivation?
It is definitely a part of it. I think sometimes our motivation suffers when we're feeling like we're just not doing well at something. Mm-hmm. And so by just reframing that through the concept of mindset can help people start to get excited and curious again about, okay, what is the learning opportunity in this challenging situation? And that itself can be very motivating. But what I always say about motivation is that it's really not all it's hyped up to be. We talk a lot about motivation, and the reality of motivation is that it comes and goes. everybody has days where they feel like they could take on the world and ride 10 horses and and hike up a mountain and, get home in time for lunch. And we all have days where, the thought of going out to the barn is exhausting, even though it's what we love, to do more than anything else in the world. And that's just normal. And so there's definitely a lot that you can do to kind of trigger motivation through the way that you're thinking through mindset. But really, the real secret to sort of high performance success is that you stop worrying so much about motivation and you start thinking about forming habits. Because habits are at the backbone of consistency. Whereas motivation is probably the least consistent thing in the world. And so if you can form habits based around an identity of being the type of person that you want to be. So, for example, do you want to be the type of person who gets up early every morning, rides 3 horses, does a great job, and then comes in and moves on to the rest of their day? Building that into your identity is really powerful. And that allows you to start really creating a habit. So a habit is something that we do automatically without too much conscious thought. And so what you want is to basically be out there. You want to be getting out of bed and halfway to the barn before you even realize that you're not really in the mood to ride, because that's just what you do every morning. Right? Or in a completely different scenario, maybe it's at the end of a long day of work and, you're exhausted, but you want to be like halfway down the road to the barn before you even kind of think about it, because that's just what you do every day on a Monday after work, right? So the power of habits is huge, and that's sort of a relatively new area in psychology, but it's being sort of tapped into it in all sorts of different areas. But I love it, and I think that it's really, really useful as a way to kind of conceptualize how we want to work with motivation. We don't want to rely too much on it because it's not very reliable.
I love that. I often feel on days when I don't feel motivated, then I kind of feel down on myself because there's somehow I've built a lot of pressure into being motivated, right? And I could see that as, for some people, probably taking away a little bit from their ability to achieve their goals, because on the days you're not feeling motivated, then you feel crappy about not being motivated, and then why am I struggling with motivation? But if you can kind of chuck that and build routine, I really like that. I'm going to work on that, so thank you, Annika.
You're welcome.
But tell us more about how people can take some easy steps to building routine that will help them achieve their goals.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a couple of sort of key components to habit building that are really sort of simple, but really important. So probably the biggest one is getting some large-scale clarity on what it is that you want to be doing. So what I mean by that is, so most people have some level of clarity around their goal setting. So maybe they feel like they want to be able to, jump 3-6 one day. Maybe they want to be able to do this certain level of dressage. Maybe they just want to train a horse really, really well, right? But the problem with that is that it's starting to be specific enough, but it's not actually specific enough. What we need to get really good clarity in terms of building, structuring out habits for ourselves, is to actually really go deep and spend a good chunk of time thinking through what do I actually really want? Why am I doing this? So the concept of figuring out your why, or why this lifestyle or this decision that I'm making to be someone who rides horses, who competes horses, why is that actually really important to me? And that can be really interesting, because sometimes when you ask people that, they kind of just stop for a sec and they're not really sure, beyond the initial response of, I love horses, which is a perfectly reasonable response. But usually if you kind of poke at it a little bit, it can be really interesting to see where people get to in terms of really figuring out why is it actually important to you? And if it's important to you to be a successful competitive rider, why is that? So by asking yourself those questions, you can start to kind of get a little bit more clarity on what your sort of purpose is as an equestrian rider. So purpose is kind of like that, the idea of having like a meaningful journey towards something. Once you sort of figure out what that purpose is, and you start to really flesh out what you want to happen along the way. So getting really detailed on, you know, what level of competition you want to get to, what does that look like, how will it actually like feel to get to that level, what does that mean for me as a person, what does that mean for my horse, what type of horse do I need, you know, what qualities in my horse do I need to get there, what qualities do I need in myself to get there. And at that level of depth starts to kind of flesh out this picture that you're building, or a lot of people would refer to it maybe as like kind of a large scale vision of what it is that you want, as opposed to goals, which are kind of smaller and more situation specific. And so once you get that clarity, you can start to then kind of work backwards into figuring out what those habits are. So that's sort of step one. And then step two is that you need to sort of recognize the habits that you have that are not helping you at the moment. And so that can be really broad. So a lot of, when we think of habits, we tend to think of things like what time we get out of bed, or the types of food that we eat, or the places that we like to go for dinner. But they can actually be much broader than that. We can have habits in the way that we think about ourselves, habits in the way that we interact with our horses, habits in the way that we interact with other people. And so if you kind of broaden the definition of a habit as just something, either a thought, a feeling, or behavior that you engage in often without a whole lot of conscious awareness or thought, it can be really interesting to sort of start to earmark, okay, what are those habits that I have that are maybe getting in my way? And then you sort of identify what those are, and then you start thinking about what are the habits that I actually really want to build. And the process of doing that basically involves a lot of commitment and a lot of repetition. So when we're building new habits in our brain, we're actually on a physical level creating new neural connections between synapses. So every time you do something, you create this little connection between the synapses in your brain. And as you do it, that same thing over and over again, that connection gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and it kind of starts to bulk up, and the brain puts like protection around it, and it becomes like a really established root in your brain. And so everything that we do as a habit has these little sort of well-established roots. And so when you're changing a habit or breaking down an old one and building a new one, you're choosing to not go down the established route and to like forge a new pathway instead. And so that takes a lot of time and repetition and effort to sort of consciously make that choice. And you're always going to get pulled back, especially at first, you're going to get pulled back to that old route because it's so strong. And so that's really the secret, is to acknowledge that it's a process. And there used to be a kind of a dialogue around, oh, you can change a habit in 21 days. But we know now that that's actually really incorrect, that it usually takes sort of a minimum of 90 days up to potentially even like 120 days to really change, especially deeply ingrained habits.
I love you speaking to that misconception, because I know just even over the last few weeks with the change in just overall routine, a lot of those habits that I had, previously are no longer available because of repetition. And so trying to form new habits and new routines, there's often been like stumbling blocks along the way, or moments where I'm like, oh, right, I'm supposed to be, out at the round pen now. That's what I wanted to do this morning. And I'm expecting that that's already kind of ingrained, even though it's only been 2-3 weeks. So I love you speaking to that, because I think that is a really common misconception that, okay, I'm going to do this for a week and now it's done and it's established and I'm just going to keep rolling with it. And
the problem with that is that then when inevitably we slip up after those couple of weeks, and we go back to our old way of doing things, sometimes we feel two things. We either feel like we failed, and therefore we get really down on ourselves. As you were talking about earlier, Emma, with motivation, things like that can like really trigger these kind of like self-doubting self-deprecating thought spirals, which just are never helpful. And then secondly, it can kind of create this idea within ourselves that we can't actually change. So the danger of that 21-day thing that was sort of a common way of talking about habits for a while is that people were like, cool, okay, I'm going to commit to this for 21 days. And then they commit for the 21 days and then it wouldn't be ingrained. And then they just like throw the whole habit change thing out the window. They'd be like, well, this doesn't work. Or they just sort of would believe that maybe they weren't mentally strong enough to do it or whatever. And so it actually sort of was more hindering than helpful. So absolutely, give yourself the time to do it, and definitely acknowledge that it's going to be a long-term process. Probably the last, to speak to that last bit there, one of the last stages to kind of mapping out successful habit change is to actually take a bunch of time to think about what the pitfalls are going to be. What are the things that are going to trip you up? And usually we can anticipate most, if not all, of the things that are going to get in our way of making the change that we want to do. And so by consciously like thinking them and listing them, it brings your awareness to them early, and then you're able to actually make like a little contingency plan for each one. So you can say, okay, when that happens, because I know what's going to happen, I'm going to do this. And when this other thing happens, I'm going to do this. And that way, when that thing eventually does occur, you kind of already have a plan of action, and it becomes much less disruptive than it would have been otherwise.
If I, as an example, let's say you say, I'm going to go out at 5 p.m. every single day, and I'm going to work on my canter transitions, right? Mm-hmm. If it's pouring rain, like it sounds like you were talking about a level of flexibility and the ability to anticipate potential problems and then how to navigate those problems. So what level of flexibility are we talking about? So if I'm going to say canter transitions every day at 5 o'clock and it's absolutely pouring rain, thunder, lightning out there, is it important to still go out to build that habit to go and practice your canter transitions, or is it acceptable for building those neural pathways just to go out and hug your horse? Like, how would you navigate that?
Yeah, totally. Well, first thing I would say is that as a goal is a little bit unrealistic. So when we're talking about goal setting, there's this great acronym that I actually use all the time. It's a bit cheesy, but it's SMART goals. You may have heard of it. It's used across like all spectrums, everything. But one of the sort of aspects of that is whether or not the goal is realistic. And we have a really sort of bad tendency of setting unrealistic goals for ourselves, which we then can't actually achieve, and therefore getting very disheartened and feeling like we're messing up or failing. But really, it's just a goal that we were never going to be able to achieve. So it's really important to kind of apply that. It's a realistic element of the SMART outline to our goal setting. So instead of so specific goals are good, but that is potentially too specific. Because there's a number of things that could prevent you from working on your canter transitions every single day. So a better way of framing that could be that I'm going to do something with my horse every day at 5 p.m. that progresses me as a rider, progresses my horse's training. Within this week time frame or within this month time frame, these are the things that I want to focus on, and canter transitions may be one of them. But that on a week-to-week basis, or even on the day basis, that you allow yourself some flexibility to choose what aspect of whatever it is that you're working on kind of makes the most sense on that day, so that you're not then feeling like you have to abandon your habit or your goal because of the rain and the thunder and the lightning. So there's a lot of strategy to goal setting and to building habits. So, and often we get ourselves into trouble with goals by sort of not making them realistic enough and not making them achievable, and then therefore creating kind of negative, again with those negative thought spirals that like to jump in on us all too easily. We're kind of giving them a window in when we don't need to.
Just for some of our listeners out there, I'm wondering if you can go through just the SMART acronym and how that might apply to a goal, and just for listeners to think about that acronym when they're setting their goals.
Yeah, definitely. So the S stands for specific. So again, like I mentioned, specific is good. We do want to have a detailed sense. So for example, a non-specific goal would be, I want to jump a 3'6" oxer within the year, right? It's a goal, but it doesn't give you a lot of kind of tangible, like you don't really know how you're going to get to jumping that height. You don't know when, how, and what time frame you want to achieve that in. So specifics are good. So the M stands for measurable. And so that is the idea that it's something you want to be able to tell. It's something you want to be able to tell if you're progressing or not progressing. So again, the specificity helps there. So a more specific goal would be to sort of map out a progression of heights that you want to achieve with your horse over a certain amount of time. And because you've mapped that out, you'll be able to measure whether or not you are kind of successfully staying on track with that, or that if you've hit some kind of a snag, and then bring your attention to sort of why you're not keeping up with the time frame that you set. There's different ways to measure goals, but that's kind of one example of it. The A stands for achievable. And so that's kind of what we were talking about, where it has to be something that you can actually achieve. So sometimes we think about goals as having to be like really big, grand things that we almost like half don't even really believe in ourselves. And so like your goal has to be to like ride for Canada at the Olympics, which is an amazing goal. And but it's not enough to just set that big, we would call that an outcome goal, right? That's like a destination goal. And that's really cool. And that can be really exciting and really be inspiring, but it's not the end of the story. There has to be many, many, many goals set in between where you are today and that goal of riding the Olympics in order to make that achievable. And then the R stands for realistic. So again, it wouldn't be realistic for a 10-year-old to say that she wanted to ride, for the Olympics in 2 years. So again, just sort of adding in this sort of element of realism to it so that it is something that we can actually achieve. And then the T stands for timely. And again, that just sort of refers to the idea of putting a time frame on your goals and really kind of holding yourself accountable to working within that time frame. And part of the reason that the realistic and the achievable parts also are so important is that has a really big interaction with our motivation. So when we're able to make small progressions regularly, so imagine you have like a list of really specific achievable goals for yourself for the next 2 months, and you get through them all and you like check all those goals off your list. That in itself is incredibly motivating because you're doing it, like you're getting it done. You can see your progress. Whereas if your one goal is just to jump that 3'6" oxer next year, you're not going to get any sense of achievement until next year when you may or may not achieve jumping that 3'6" oxer. You're not giving yourself those little boosts of accomplishment and motivation along the way that are so important to sort of sustain motivation over time.
Good answer. I can imagine that things like having those big goals that are too far away can add to the pressure that people put on themselves, right? In addition to kind of the program falling apart because those small pieces that helps them feel successful aren't in place. But what are some of the other challenges that riders have to deal with when it comes to managing pressure, and how do you help them manage pressure?
That's a really good question. I think pressure, of course, is sort of universal across all sports. However, with equestrian, there's a very real level of danger to what we do, and with that, it doesn't take more than a couple of sort of scary experiences to have to sort of dealing with a little bit of that element of fear wrapped in with the pressure. And I think that, most people, once they've been riding for a while, there is sort of there's a little bit of fear present in the back of your mind, because you just have this knowledge that, there is danger and that things, have the potential to go wrong. And so I do see that level of anxiety kind of mixing with a high amount of pressure that people put on themselves in the equestrian sport in particular. And the results are, people sort of really struggling with stress and tension and anxiety at competitions, which of course, again, unique to us, has a spin-off effect because that then directly impacts our horses and they get stressed and anxious and things can go downhill quickly. So probably the starting point for tackling all that is to teach people some sort of immediate relaxation strategies. So you're going to laugh because it just sounds so easy, but really actually learning how to breathe properly is the most underrated tool ever. And it's basically, it comes back to biology, that when we're stressed and we're feeling the pressure of a situation, our brain is actually interpreting that as a threat. Like a life or death threat, like deep down in your older brain where it's not really aware of the modern world and it doesn't realize that we're not actually going to die because of this. It's interpreting that threat situation, that stress situation as quite serious. And so that's why we get thrown into this fight or flight response, where we sort of feel this really heightened anxiety and your brain gets kind of like scrambly and you can't quite remember what it is that how it was that you did that thing so well, back at the barn yesterday. Everything feels more difficult. That all of that comes down to the biology of the fight or flight response, where the brain's actually like pumping, adrenaline and cortisol through your system and preparing you for survival. And so what we have to do, the very first step, is to kind of flip the switch in the brain and try to shut down that fight or flight response and reactivate the part of our brain that deals with like rational thinking and decision making, so that we can just sort of take the control back and pull ourselves back together. And so often just sort of explaining that what's going on in your mind can be really helpful to people, helps to sort of have a greater understanding of that experience that we all have when we're in that fight or flight mode, and allows people to start to recognize it. And once you can like recognize like, oh, okay, I'm in that fight or flight mode, then you can start to use strategies to change it. So one of the best things, the quickest ways to flip your brain, is to engage in some real deep breathing. Now, the secret to this is that it's something that you have to practice a lot, and you have to practice it in non-stressful situations and stressful situations to get to the point where you can do it properly under a lot of pressure is actually helpful. So the key to deep breathing is that you actually breathe right down into the bottom of your stomach and hold it for a couple of seconds, and then exhale slowly right down till there's no air left in your body, and then again hold for a couple of seconds and then right back in. And by creating that pause at the top and the bottom of the breath, actually sends a signal to the brain that we're okay, we're not going to die, it's all good. we can go back to thinking rationally. And so, that, if nothing else, that's something that it's a relatively easy thing to practice. And again, I would really recommend to people to start to make that a habit in their life, to start practicing that type of deep breathing, so that it can be a tool that they can use when they're feeling under pressure. The second thing is to start asking yourself questions. So when we're trying to reactivate that more cognitive, rational part of the brain, the best way to do it is to pose a question to yourself, because that part of the brain wants to answer, wants to give you responses. And so if you're, there feeling the pressure, feeling the stress, the anxiety of everything, then you can sort of take those deep breaths and then ask yourself, okay, what is it that I want to achieve today? Right? Okay, what do I need to do to achieve that? See what the brain comes up with. Okay, specifically, what is my one thing that I'm going to focus on in this round? What is my one thing that I want to walk away with today, feeling like I did well? What? And really, it doesn't matter too much what you're asking, but it's the act of asking yourself questions that are going to start kind of priming your mind towards creating the solutions or the responses that you need.
It's fascinating just thinking through that process, and I'm sure there's a lot of equestrians out there who can relate to that moment right before they go into the arena, to really putting themselves on the spot for, to achieve that goal that they've been working towards, and feeling that sensation in their body of that anxiety building. And, listening to you talk, I'm thinking about all those moments myself and going through those processes. And I appreciate you pointing to how important it is to practice that ahead of time. Because in that moment, of course, just going, oh, right, Annika said to breathe.
Usually the ship has sailed at that stage. The other thing too is that when it's entirely possible to take what we think is a deep breath that only goes into your chest. So you can even try it now, like you can take a deep breath, but that breath only just went into my chest. And when we chest breathe, that sort of fuels the panic. So you make sure you can feel like you're trying to deep breathe there, but actually what you're doing is kind of fueling that acceleration of stress in your body. And so it's really important to practice that right down into your stomach, and the pause and the forcing your body and your brain to take that pause and then start again. I think one more thing just before we move on from pressure that's really useful is that, yes, we want to ask those questions and kind of prime the brain to start coming up with those responses for us. But it's not a solution to try to think your way or focus your way out of the pressure. So sometimes people feel like and I'm intimately familiar with this because this was like 100% my technique as a rider before I learned otherwise, was that I felt like when I was really stressed and under pressure, I had to focus on every aspect of my riding in order to make sure that I was doing it correctly. Right down to I would suddenly start to weirdly focus on how deep my heels were, even though that's not something you actually need to think about when you've been riding for 15, 20 years. So what happens is, because we're worried about the outcome and we're stressed, it's almost like our brain goes into kind of micromanage mode. And we start thinking that we need to suddenly pay attention to all these things about our position or way of riding that we don't normally think about. So that is sort of the biggest issue with, and this comes up a lot in jumping and with distances, and this was actually kind of at the root of my own issue with not being able to see a distance back when I was sorting through all this myself, was that because I suddenly felt like I couldn't do it, I was overthinking the process. Instead of allowing my body, my unconscious mind, to actually make use of the good habits that I built up over a lifetime of riding, which allowed me to jump a jump without actually thinking too much about it. So if you think about, jumping a big oxer at home, when there's no pressure and you feel really good about it and you're really confident about it, you just kind of canter up to the thing, right? You create the good canter almost automatically because, again, that's a habit, and you put your horse in balance automatically because that's a habit that you formed through your riding. And you hold your body correctly automatically. And we can really kind of sabotage ourselves when we all of a sudden start to micromanage all of those processes that actually would function much better if we left them alone. So one of my mentors, Dave Fries, is a great psychology consultant, and he has this analogy about how in our conscious mind, there's about 5 little versions of yourself helping you out. But in our subconscious mind, there's 50 little versions of ourselves helping us out. That's based off the idea that our unconscious mind is actually 50 times faster at processing things than our conscious mind. And so if you imagine that you've got 50 little helpers working in your unconscious mind behind the scenes, and it's those 50 little helpers that are managing the process of you jumping around that course successfully. So when the 5 little helpers start to try to take control back from the 50 helpers, disaster ensues because the 5 helpers can't manage all the things that the 50 helpers are managing. There's not enough of them. And so he has this great thing that he says to the people he works with, where he's like, just let the 50 helpers do the work. Get out of there. And so the key to that is is just choosing like one thing to focus on with your conscious mind, just one thing, and not trying to think about 18 things simultaneously. So maybe that's, you're just going to focus on your rhythm or your core or whatever it is, right? And that one thing, maybe the thing that hasn't quite translated into a habit yet, that does require a little bit more conscious awareness. And then you need to kind of let those 50 helpers do the rest.
What a wonderful tip. I'm going to temporarily lay off my 5 helpers and let my 50 helpers do the work. That's a great idea. So now I'm thinking, okay, so before I go out to the barn, I'm going to practice my breathing. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to, when I'm working with my horse, I'm going to focus on my kind of single thing and just expect all of my habits and all of my already programmed in my brain things to do their thing. My 50 helpers can do their thing. Mm-hmm. I'm going to let go of focusing on motivation, and I'm going to do some SMART goal setting and focus on building good habits. What a wonderful podcast this has been so far.
Oh, good. I'm really glad that you're getting lots of tips out of it. And that's a great summary of some really great steps that you and anyone can take right away to start just, taking more control over their thoughts and their mind.
Mm-hmm.
We've covered so much already, but I'm curious, is there, in addition to those pieces, just any little tidbits that you often kind of suggest to equestrians to start integrating that our listeners might be able to integrate as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think a really common piece that I come across with equestrians is a feeling of a lack of self-confidence. It's really, really common. I have a niggling feeling that it's more common in equestrian sport, although I obviously don't have the data to back that up, but it does seem to be a really prevalent issue. And in a way, I have some suspicions that that's sort of rooted again in this culture of not putting a lot of care and attention into ourselves as athletes, and focusing a lot on the horse. And what we have a tendency to do is to accept all the problems as our own, and to cede all of the successes and the good outcomes to our horse. So it's a really common thing, you'll hear if someone has a really good round and you tell them, oh my God, that was amazing. And they'll be like, oh my God, no, he was fantastic. It has nothing to do with me. He just killed it. They won't take any of that credit for riding well. But if the round goes horribly, then that same rider would be like, oh my God, that was all my fault. I picked at that. I did this. And so it's just an interesting pattern that I know that I lived, that I lived as an equestrian athlete, and that also I sort of see reflected in a lot of people. And so I think that the danger of that is that it builds this story in our head. And you mentioned earlier about this idea of a narrative and a story, and that's a really powerful concept because, we mentioned how we have these automatic thoughts that are in self-talk that are fueled by our core beliefs. And over a lifetime, we do a lot of talking to ourselves through the day. There's sort of a constant stream, constant narrative. So over time, over a lifetime, those thoughts that we have about ourselves do build up to equal a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And the secret of confidence is that confidence is really like the result of that story. And so if you're telling yourself every day a story about yourself that adds up to you not being competent, not being successful, kind of dropping the ball when you need to and being saved by your horse, et cetera, I think it creates this long-term experience of just, and really kind of a core belief even around just sort of not having the faith and trust in yourself as a rider, not having the confidence to really believe in yourself. And there's really interesting sort of negative spin-offs of that, I think, because when we're not confident, it's very sort of shaky ground. And again, it leads to a lot of inconsistency in our own emotions and the way that we sort of approach our riding careers and our goals. And that then has sort of negative spin-off effects, obviously for ourselves, and then again also for the horses, because they're the ones that kind of have to absorb our mood swings and cope with people who are sort of riding them in inconsistent ways. So I suppose that's sort of my sell line to try to get equestrians to invest more in themselves, because I know that it does always kind of come back to the horse, and and I totally relate to that, because that is the way it is. We do love our horses so much, but I really do believe that by investing more in yourself and taking the time to start to dig into your core beliefs, start to work with your own self-talk, and sort of start to consciously create a mindset, like all this stuff ties together, right? Like having the right mindset, shifting your core beliefs, addressing the way that you're talking to yourself every day, excuse me, managing your anxiety, and it all ties together to create a story that results in us being able to really trust ourselves and have that self-confidence. I take a bit of water here.
Go for it.
So I do see that as being really common. And I think that it's something that equestrians need to feel like it's okay to invest in themselves as athletes and invest in their own personal development as a part of the partnership that they're in, so that the whole partnership can benefit.
Beautifully put. Yeah. Is there, I almost feel like that last little chunk that you just talked about kind of pulled everything that you've said together so nicely. We could possibly, although I don't really want to end, we could probably wrap things up, unless there's a question, Mira, that you had that we didn't cover, or Annika, if there's anything else that you feel is really important or that you're really passionate about that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, we covered everything that I had and exceeded, so I feel like that was very thorough. Annika, was there anything that you had hoped to touch on that we might have missed?
No, actually, I think we managed to hit all the things that I sort of had in my mind that might be fun to talk about. Yeah, no, absolutely. That was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for great questions.
Yay. Well, and please promote yourself, because you're fantastic. So if if there's, if you've got Facebook page, website, email, how do people contact you? Give yourself a little plug.
Totally, I know. Thanks for the reminder. I'm really bad at remembering to do that. So just to give, I suppose, a little bit of a context, some people maybe aren't sure about how you even go about working with a sports psychologist and sort of what that looks like. So usually the interaction will take place either in person or virtually, and that's the beauty of the power of the internet today. And in my first work with a sports psychologist, was done over Skype, and it was certainly very, very effective. And so there's no value lost in sort of not being there in person, which is great. So it'll look like a series of conversations. The goal is always to solve the problem for you as quickly as possible and give you the skills and the tools to go on and keep being successful on your own. And so we actually always try to kind of lose our clients as quickly as we can, ironically, because that means that we've done our job, and that they now have the skills and the confidence to carry on without us, which is great. So it usually takes place over a handful of conversations. That relationship can stretch out over the long term, absolutely, if you're interested in that. And it usually looks like zeroing and identifying what you feel you're struggling with at the moment, and then identifying the sort of mental strategies that we can put in place to start to address that problem. Even if you don't feel like you have a specific problem at the moment, but you're just interested in general about improving your performance, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of value to learning this stuff before you encounter a problem, so that you are mentally prepared for it when it does, and having lived the way of finding it where you wait until everything hits the fan and you don't know where else to turn to find sports psychology, I can definitely encourage people to try the other way, to try and learn even a little bit about this ahead of time, so that you can be ahead of the inevitable challenges that we all encounter. So if you're interested and specifically in learning more about what I do or talking to me, there you can reach me through, so I do have a website. It is www.mindawareperformance.com. And that will bring you to the shared website of myself and my business partner here in Ireland. So that's the name of our company here. You can email me directly at the email annika@mindawareperformance.com. If you're interested in learning more, and initial consultations are always free, so don't worry about reaching out, even if you're just curious about the context of what that could look like. So I do a lot of individual work with athletes, and I also do kind of group workshop sessions. So those can be a lot of fun, because it allows people to kind of interact and learn about the concepts in a group setting. It's not super personal, so if you're worried about sort of getting into personal stuff, you don't really need to go there. It's just a way of learning about kind of the tips and the tricks and the techniques that can come in really handy in a group setting altogether. So examples of that would be like hosting like a workshop at your barn. Again, with the current situation, of course, everybody's having to get creative and do these types of things online. But we have actually done some online workshops with great success. And the nice thing is that they're relatively easy to organize. You don't have to get everyone in one place. So yeah, so those are kind of the two options, individual work or more of a group setting, or that can be done in kind of a webinar or hopefully one day again in person. I suppose the last piece would be direct competitive work, where you can, if you're really sort of specifically focusing on competitions, there's a way to kind of focus our work in on that and kind of tailoring our interactions to be sort of on the day of your competition or potentially at your competition to kind of specifically help put the ideas into practice at those kind of crunch moments when it's really necessary.
Beautiful. Okay, well, we will post all of your links and stuff on the description for the podcast, so people can, for fast information on Annika, check out our link. And I think, Mira, I think that's a wrap.
I think that's a wrap.
If you want more Friends on Horses, you can find us on Facebook at Friends on Horses Podcast.
Check it out for all the latest and greatest horsey news.
You can find us on the web at friendsonhorsespodcast.com.
Or Instagram at friendsonhorses_podcast.
Like what you hear? Help us quit our hay jobs by supporting Friends on Horses. You can support us by rating our episodes on iTunes.
Becoming an ongoing sponsor through Patreon.
Or simply by spreading the word about our show.
Have some feedback?
We'd love to hear from you.
Contact us via email at friendsonhorses@gmail.com.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.